yesterday I kind of hinted at the fact that the Eiffel Tower, like, it was once controversial. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But I wanted to get from all of you your viewpoints on this. What would you say is the biggest challenge facing your industry right now? Eladia, I'll start with you.
I've been working with Naskapi Nation of Kawawa-Chikimach, and they have approximately 8 weeks within which to build anything, and they have to transport by train all of their materials up from Montreal. So they use prefabricated light wood framing panels that they put together using local crews, all local crews from the region, because that's the most cost-efficient way of doing it. So they experience a whole lot of economic leakage to economies that aren't their own. We did a community housing plan over the last couple of years with them. And what came out of that through asking questions and listening is that what they really need is a panelization plant right there in their community. Now, this is not generally a fundable element from the federal government, who generally assists First Nations in their undertakings. So it's a real challenge to address issues of economic leakage when it comes to the materials that you use to actually create architecture, especially in remote Canada, which is the vast majority of Canada, as you know. So this is not such a problem in the more densely populated regions of Canada, but it affects us all, because when we think about the architecture of the everyday, it's using homogeneous materials that are globally available. Usually, we as Canadians supply the raw resources. Oftentimes, those go south of the border for processing, and then we purchase them back. And so
that doesn't make sense.
It doesn't, and it's not really a sustainable way of building in the long run. And so we really have to look at ways, I think, as a nation, of reconsolidating our architectural endeavors so that local economies benefit. So I think this is so important, and I'm so inspired by Naskapi Nation that they're actually moving forward with that initiative.
Carol, what would you say are the challenges your industry is facing?
Well, I think that some of it has to do with an idea about how we just change culture in general in terms of how we work, how we procure work. So we're inherently competitive, and the RFPs, the proposal calls that we have.
That's the RFP.
Yes, request for proposals is the method with which we procure work for public agencies usually, and it's inherently competitive, and it leads to, in my mind, a lack of knowledge sharing and collaboration between and among architects, engineers, when with the climate emergency, we're not going to get there working in silos. We really have to share knowledge, share innovation, and I think that this is something that I think is not only on us as architects and designers to actually initiate that, but for agencies such as public agencies like NRCan and other agencies to help to share that knowledge, to help to proliferate the innovation so that we can all benefit and move along together.
What's NRCan?
NRCan is National Resources of Canada, and they sponsor a lot of research, and I think that we can all benefit from that shared information so that we can continuously improve and share and change. And also we work in an environment where everything is, our codes and regulations are incredibly prescriptive. And so some of the things that Eladia was talking about having smudging, for instance, in spaces that would be unexpected. As long as our buildings perform to certain levels, I think some of the prescriptive tenets in our codes and regulations preclude us doing these kinds of inclusive or innovative ways of constructing. And so I think we just need to come together as a community and also look at how our buildings can really, really serve and share as much knowledge as possible. And so that's a bit of a challenge for us, is to understand how we can continuously learn from each other and create that community.
And Don, what do you think?
Well, I really agree with the points that Carol has been making. When you think buildings consume more than half the energy and carbon resources in North America, and of course we overconsume in North America far more than our share of resources. So it's an enormous impact that we make as architects on the environment. And the kind of challenge is transforming our methods of practice to be far more environmentally respectful. And I think but the good news is that I think, as Carol points out, we're really learning radically new and quickly, at a radical speed, I should say, ways of collaborating together. Architecture has always been a team sport. It's always part of a collaborative effort, but we're developing more and more abilities to kind of work successfully in those models. And there are extraordinary tools, digital tools, research tools, the knowledge of young architects. I mean, it's a cliche to say, like, nobody would ever hire me anymore because I'm not as smart as the kind of young people who are working in our office. Like, they're just, extraordinarily capable. And so that on the positive side presents incredible resources to confront these environmental issues and make buildings measurably much more successful in their performance.
Marianne?
So I'll bring the cost factor into it. I think building costs have risen dramatically, and I think just as we're experiencing it as consumers, the cost of construction has risen dramatically. And frankly, construction was relatively cheap or inexpensive relative to European and some other cultures. I think the challenge will be is to maintain quality in construction. So we don't just let it go down to the lowest common denominator and build with the cheapest, most available materials. We need a reinvestment into our materials and our labor force and how we're training people to actually build quality, durability, regenerative, buildings that will last and can be reused, can be retooled, reprogrammed over hundreds of years, which is what we see with projects. Some of the greatest projects are actually being able to add to existing heritage buildings and add new buildings to them. So I think it comes back for people to understand we need to make an investment, because if you think about the ability in Ontario to build with brick, we have a variety of materials, but looking at buildings over 100 years, what are the buildings that still look the best, that can soil very gracefully, can actually develop a patina? It is brick. And yet brick has gone way off the charts in terms of the way it is fabricated using fossil fuels. So we're in the process of talking to brick manufacturers and asking them to reconsider to go electric, because everything will go electric as we develop electric sources of energy that are based on electric power. So, it's a kind of vicious circle, but I think we need to break that circle of the way we do things and think about durability, longevity, quality of materials, sustainability, and how those materials tie into life cycle.
You mentioned resources. I don't have to tell any of you that there is a housing crisis in this province and also across the country. Is this something that you all think about?
Absolutely.
Because, it feels like, land is at a premium right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is tied to this notion of investment too, because I think that we can't let one crisis in a way contribute to another crisis. And there has been some conversation about how current green standards are driving the cost of construction up, and therefore it's going to impede the speed at which we can address the housing crisis. I don't think we can be that short-sighted. I think we have to invest in both. We cannot continue to build the way we used to build at the expense of the planet, because we are trying to, put out one. It's just that sort of whack-a-mole thing. We're not going to be addressing everything holistically, and so the housing crisis is real. We have the largest mass migration in human history into urban centers globally. That is happening now, and that's what we are experiencing. And so we cannot take that influx of people into urban centers without constructing new housing. And I think the type of housing that we construct has to be addressed. The sort of tiny condo with the great view we have to think about all of the things we've been talking about: quality of light, quality of space, quality of social space, and actually creating places that feel good with the kind of materials that we use, and maybe it's not just coming down to square footage and what's available to you, and investing in rental housing and investing in affordable housing. This actually has to be the way forward and not look at buildings just as commodities, and for developers to also think about buildings that they're going to hang on to. And then they'll get really interested in energy efficient buildings, because if they're hanging on to their buildings, they're going to want them to be more efficient. And so I think there should be incentives for developers to actually create more rental housing and to do energy efficient buildings, and to really think about the quality of space in all the ways that we've been talking about, not just the
also relationship between people. If you have a 400 square foot 3-bedroom unit, I mean, it's crazy. How do you sustain a relationship? How do you let your children grow up
How do you make community?
How do you make community? So I think we've made the argument to CMHC. They want so many units, and we've said, what about heads in beds? Isn't that a criteria that you should? So we can do larger units, have more family living in the city too, in 3-bedroom units, or have people build. I think we're just totally on the wrong track. And so it comes back down to that, the first thing we talked about 3 days ago, values. How do architects use their value system and their vision and their value system to actually address these issues? And I think one by one, as a community, and we ask, I mean, we have a pretty great community, actually. We're competitors, but we're also peers and respectful peers of each other. How do we actually demand these kinds of changes and say, it's not like, oh, if I don't take this commission, somebody else will. It's actually saying, no, we need to change. We need the support of other architects to say they agree and make changes to how we are doing housing, and confront developers and work out different models.
And it's not a shortage of land. You let off by saying, we have a housing crisis, it's a shortage of land. It's not a shortage of land.
Then what is it?
It's many, many other aspects, in the kind of financing, the regulation, the incentives for affordability, the support for affordability. There's a lot of other issues, but there is a ton of land within the urban boundaries of, for example, the City of Toronto, enormous capacity to build upwards of 1 million units.
What about the idea, like one of the ideas that came up because during the I don't know, we're still in the pandemic, but because of office buildings not being used, what about this idea of turning those office buildings into residential properties?
I mean, the tough part about that is, residential buildings tend, particularly above the 10th or 12th floor, tend to have a regulation and a sweet spot of about 8,000 to 9,000 square feet per floor. A typical office building in Toronto has 25,000 square feet per floor. So that the problem is the depth of the, you get spaces that are okay for office work, but too deep and
They're
too
not
far away
okay
from
for office
natural.
work.
But older buildings, and using older buildings, like the City of Calgary is looking at buildings that have the smaller square footage, that have a core to glazing that is a depth that is less. So, I mean, I think it's very expensive, but it's very expensive to build new. But it is about our values. If you have a building that can be taken back to a concrete shell, and then yes, you have to drill through for all the plumbing. Yes, but if it's an ideal footprint and it's in a downtown location, you can, have people live downtown rather than building remote or building just scads of towers, as we're doing in Toronto.
Right.
So I think we really need to press different solutions.
And if you look through just how lightly touched some of our main streets are with little 2-story buildings all along, the ability to either increase that street wall to 6-8 stories and then just have a different kind of street wall in rather than just saying it's got to be 40 stories or 2. As you mentioned, Don, in Toronto we have tremendous capacity just to intensify even all of our main streets and to even adaptively reuse a lot lot of lower buildings.
And the attitude
lighter
has been
weight.
40-story towers, and that's problematic. If you drive up through Yonge Street, it's problematic on this. We need to. I think your idea of two stories that become 6 or 8 as you go deeper in the site, and so it's a scale. We talk about light and onto the benefits of light, scale for children walking on the streets, the
Eyes on the
ambiance
street
of
and
retail.
community
Yeah, I mean,
spaces
it's
at the
just,
grade
I think
level.
the solutions that are being driven by other interests are very poor, and our city is, as we build, is deteriorating around us.
Eladia?
Yeah, I think you're talking about the missing middle.
That's it?
Yeah,
Missing middle.
Yeah, essentially that we've been focusing on either the super tall, super dense towers or single family homes, and not much in the middle. So if you look at a lot of say New York City, it's sort of like the 3-story walk-ups, and it's very dense, but quite homey feeling actually. Like you always see the financial district. Don't go there; it's a terrible place. But if you go anywhere else in New York City, you have these sort of 3-story walk-ups, and it's quite comfortable feeling. And it's something that I'm not seeing in Toronto. I'm seeing like just that juxtaposition of the super not dense suburban pattern and this very tall. And the very tall towers are extremely carbon intensive. They are not a way forward in terms of developing affordable housing or sustainable housing. And plus they're uncomfortable, like just from an urban fabric perspective. I did want to counterpoint what you were saying about durability and longevity of buildings with another solution. Not that we don't need also durable and long-lived buildings, but there is sort of another architectural approach that has not been explored in a long time, and that's sort of the ephemeral architecture that's made of very easily renewable materials and can be returned to the environment very easily and is actually at a low capital investment. So maybe not would work for urban locales, but certainly might work well for more rural or suburban locales. And I think that's, architects haven't really explored this recently. So I was approached by an entity that wanted to spray concrete out of nozzles into like a 3D printed architecture, right? And I was like, what's your feedstock? Because this is really exciting. This is how termites build, and they build these amazing things using this exact strategy. And they're like, oh yeah, we use concrete. I'm like, okay, so that doesn't have any insulating quality and it's super high carbon investment, right? So wouldn't it be exciting if we figured out how to use a feedstock for something like that was actually from the local environment, like a bio feedstock that captured biomass, not just heavy timber, but actually the smaller, easily renewable biomass, like switchgrass or something that grows in a year, straw bale, something like that.
Mycelium.
So
mushrooms.
Right.
Can we explore this as architects? I would love to see that as the next chapter of investigation.
Yeah.
I mentioned controversy before. Some of the most controversial buildings earn a place in history, and I mentioned the Eiffel Tower. Is there a role for controversy in architecture? And Don, I want to go to you first, because before we started taping, you were telling me a story about the Eiffel Tower. Can you share it with us too?
There is a famous story of the Eiffel Tower being so controversial when it was first built, and one of the great opponents was Guy de Maupassant, the French writer, who made a point of going to the Eiffel Tower and having lunch every day in the restaurant in the tower, because it was the only place he could be in Paris and not look at the tower, which he considered a blight on the urban environment. So it's a kind of an amusing observation.
But then how has it become one of the wonders of the, everyone wants to take a picture, everybody wants to go to Paris, everybody wants to get a view or a selfie with the Eiffel Tower?
I mean, there are those structures that emerge that the community, the people adopt. They adopt, they invest, they're excited by structures, and structures like the Eiffel Tower become famous because, in a sense, over the longer trajectory, both Parisians and people around the world embraced it as a symbol of modernity in Paris. And so that sense of it being a kind of recognizable icon. Is that the same as the CN Tower? I mean, many cities adopted that sense of a kind of tall, relatively mute spire. I mean, not doing anything other than holding up antennas and things that, or a kind of lookout point that you could travel up and travel down. lots of cities tried that idea as definition. I'm not sure it has much
Well, we have the CN
validity.
Tower. We have our own little
Yeah.
spire,
But
which gives idea.
and then you've got the kind of famous Bilbao effect, where as part of revitalizing the Basque city of Bilbao, an art museum was created by Frank Gehry. It was part of really creating not an icon of a different kind, an icon that was had a completely different dimension, separate from the kind of spire represented by the Eiffel Tower. And so there are many ways to kind of think of those structures, which become the defining opportunities for a metropolis or a large city.
What about you, Marianne? Is there a role for controversy in architecture?
I think there absolutely is, but it has to be, I think architects have responsibilities. We talk about, is an architect closer to a doctor, the medical profession, where you say do no harm, or are we more like lawyers who will pick up, if I may say, almost anything and defend a criminal because that is part of their mandate. So I think we have to, we have to really feel like we're on the right side of a controversy by having, and I think we have to listen to what our peers say when you have a community of others that are opposing a project that you may be working on. I think you have to think very seriously, what are the values that have driven this, and is this good for our city, our community, our waterfront, are we doing the right thing? Because I think we are more like at this table, I think we are more like the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm.
Well, Carol and Eladia, I wanted to get your views on it as well. Is it about pushing the bar of design, or is it something else? Carol?
For me, I think that I totally agree with what you were saying, Marianne, about being on the right side of a controversy. And sometimes you can't just accept the opposition as saying, well, every opposition is going to every project's going to have an opposition, or someone's not going to have not in my neighborhood or something like that. And so you really have to dig deep and understand what it is you're doing. Some of the projects that I've been involved in, and I recall that a project that is an incredible project for the University of Toronto, a multi-faith center that was the first project I worked on at MTA. That was mired in controversy because as a university they said, we have no business creating a religious building. But what that building was doing was actually creating a multi-faith center so that everybody who was not of the Judeo-Christian tradition would have a place where they felt universally welcomed. And so you had to sort of stand by that. And we had an incredible client, an incredible team of people who said, this has value. This has value because people didn't leave their faith at the gates of the university when they came. And we had to give them dignified ways of celebrating and convening together and learning from each other. And I think you said it in glorious otherness, like to be aware of each other. And you had to sort of stand by that and understand that what you were on the right side. And then the controversy went away quite quickly. But I remember that in retrospect, looking at that building now, that is like 15 years on, 17 years on, why would that have been a controversial thing? The transformation in our attitudes, I think, was really important to know when you were on the right side of controversy.
And Eladia?
I've been trying to think through your question because it's a really important one. Architects are very controversy averse because we move in fairly political spheres with people who have power. And the way that we present ourselves can also depend on whether we get future commissions. So it has an impact on our livelihood. So we're very controversy averse. But I will say that I got into architecture because we have about 150 years of catch up to do in integrating Indigenous perspectives into design. And I think it's a really important endeavor because Canadians need it. I'll use an example of the Indigenous people space across from Parliament. So that was a gift of a disused 30-year vacant former American embassy to Indigenous peoples of Canada. Algonquin Nation was not named in the gift. That's their territory. Ottawa sits on unceded Algonquin territory, there's never been a treaty in place to legally recognize inhabitation by anyone other than Algonquin Nation on that territory. So there was controversy associated with that endeavor. So myself, David Fortin, and Wanda Dalla Costa, and our advising elder, Winnie Pitawanakwat, came together to tackle this really difficult question of how do you re-inhabit a space that's highly colonial. It's a Beaux-Arts structure, that we talked about that, a very hierarchical, extremely divorced from its site. You have to use stairs to get up. There's one tiny little door on the wrong side for us, which is on the east, and the door is actually on the north. And so we created this almost protest architectural concept, and we kind of knew it wasn't ever going to get built that way, but we thought it was important to express things. So if you want to take a look at it, Assembly of First Nations hosts our design and the whole explanation of what it is in 3 languages, English, French, and Anishinaabemowin on their site. Check it out. It's I found it a really amazing experience to be part of. And what Winnie Pitawanakwat said is, you guys are overthinking this. You need to make a place where our grandmothers are proud to come there, and they immediately say, that's our place. Right. And so I think you have to tell the truth. We were gifted this building. Yeah, maybe it was a really controversial gift. Yeah, maybe there were some flaws in how it was gifted. Yeah, but there's a good intention there. She's like, right. Honor the gift. Mm-hmm. What do we do with a gift to honor it? We wrap it in a blanket. We wrap it in good things. And so she's like, this is reality, Deal with it in a good way. And what's come out of that is the team that Two-Row Brian Porter and Matt Hickey are part of this team, who are rethinking Block 2, which is that whole block including Indigenous people space. We had reclaimed, kind of just sort of also taken this vacant lot that's right across from Parliament as a place for, Indigenous activity, a sacred fire, dance circles, a place where we can demonstrate our traditional architectures. Wasn't really part of the gift, but we just sort of like this. So Brian Porter and Two-Row Architects negotiated with their team, and that space is going to be available to Indigenous people space as a place to actually sit directly on the land, and a new entrance from the east to that space. So, you know what? Something good came out of it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful scheme, and it's a wonderful way that architecture can speak to challenges and big challenges. So I think it's a very beautiful, response.
Yeah.
Dawn,
predictable.
You knew I was coming to this because you've met controversy,
yep,
and
yep.
Most recently for the development
Ontario
of the spa,
Place.
at Ontario Place. The Toronto Society of Architects
Yep.
made a public statement in the spring. As an architect, what is it like being at the center of something the architectural community feels so passionately about?
It's a very, very important question, and I think to kind of a point Marianne made a minute ago, when you're getting engaged in a project like Ontario Place, you need to think very hard about what's important and how do you make a great park for the 21st century. What are the key values, and do you commit yourself to be involved? So the controversy has been huge, but we are completely on the right side of this. I'm convinced. Ontario Place has been an extraordinary jewel in the crown of the city for a long time, from its inception. It was a place in the lake, which post Expo 67, it was a moment for Ontarians to kind of gather and celebrate and be excited about the future. 70 acres of land was landfilled of new land was created in the lake. And Eb Zeidler and Michael Huff, the landscape architect, there was extraordinary work was done on, and it was a jewel for 20, 30 years. But, it deteriorated and it closed in 2012. And then there was a public panel put together, and the panel consulted, several thousand people. There were dozens of meetings, 50 meetings with community groups. there's a report that's online that is the results of the panel. I mean, there were members of the Daniels faculty of architecture on the panel. Former Mayor John Tory led the panel before he was mayor. And they came up with 18 recommendations. And those recommendations really define the vision for the future of Ontario Place. And then the first implementation was to build in 2017 the Great Trillium Park on the east side of the island, 7.5 acres, spectacularly beautiful park. West 8 were the landscape architects. Then 2019, the province said, okay, we'll go out for proposals, and 34 proposals were received from around the world. And we partnered with a group who are based in Vienna. And they're an extraordinary group.
But they're not Ontarian.
Yeah.
Because we've been talking
they're
about
not Ontarians.
And I'll say why I mentioned that. We were there in May, and there's an area of 850 trees on that spot that are meant to be taken away.
There are not 850 trees on that spot.
Okay, but what's the idea? Because you said you're on the right side of it. So how can you explain to people why you're on the right side of this?
I don't know. I don't think you should justify the project. I think you should
I'm
answer
not trying to justify the
because
project.
there's so many challenges associated with the privatization of public land
It's
with a
not been
95-year.
privatized.
Well, it is, So I think maybe better would be to answer the question about how do you feel about being, rather than trying to justify that this is the right project. I think that half of the world, or maybe even more, half of the city, feels like it's not the right thing to do. But you're, caught in a kind of controversy where
We're not caught in a controversy.
Well,
Why are you? Why is it? The question that I asked is, you said you are on the right side of this. We've
Why
been
is
talking
that?
about values, so I just wanted to know why you said that.
So the question is, how do you make a great park in the 21st century? If you pose what makes a great park, 70 acres of Ontario Place, 60 acres, a new park that's 1.5 times the size of Trinity Bellwoods Park. It will be the largest park in the downtown, number one. Number two, the wellness environment, and it's not a spa, it's a wellness environment that is very large. It's about 10% of the area of Ontario Place. And the idea is that Ontario Place has water's edge and park space for 6 months of the year, but for 6 months of the year it's cold and windy. And if you look at the kind of population of the city, is it reasonable that there should be a kind of large public space that is a kind of biophilic environment that's invested with culture and health and wellness over that period of time?
I think people will debate that because the people we spoke to, some of them said that they use the space year-round, and what's happening is going to it won't be accessible to everybody. But I just want to get like a personal.
Entirely accessible to everybody.
Okay, we will debate that another day. But I just wanted to get from since you're here, what's it like to be stuck in the middle of this architectural debate?
I'm very interested in debate. I think it's a very important debate to have. I'm totally positive being stuck in the middle of the debate. I think there's a ton of misinformation, and it's frustrating. But it doesn't change our view that we're doing a very important thing that I am totally sure when it's done, it will be an important public space in the city. And it's certainly the kind of 60 acres will be
what about
extraordinary.
just like the lease, something like taking public land and privatizing it with a lease for 95 years, when you know that spa or that building won't last that long? So they're kind of conditions.
Why will that building not last that long?
Well, maybe it will become a casino,
Why would it become a casino?
I think you need to listen to what people are saying.
We're listening very carefully.
Yeah,
but I think,
wrong side of this one, though.
but I think, I don't think we're on the wrong side of it, frankly. And I think that the issue of someone saying, well, it's not sustainable, or, birds will fly into the glass, or it will fail and it will become a casino. There's no basis for any of those propositions. And to say it's privatization, I mean...
Is it not commercial privatization?
Yeah.
It's not commercial privatization. It is. So if you read the report that defined the vision for the project in 2012, it very clearly stated that there should be a year-round, publicly accessible facility that could be used 12 months of the year. It's clearly set out as one of the ambitions of the project. That it should be sustainable, it should be environmentally effective, that it should be minimum LEED Platinum or better, which it will be, that it should be, so it's
In 2012.
the kind of the project and its private sector component is part of the vision that was defined by the community.
Don, that's a big stretch.
It's
That
not
is
a stretch. Read the, I commend you to download the.
I
the-
have.
Well, Dawn, you mentioned that it is
Yes.
accessible, but in May, part of the space was closed off to people in the city, and people don't have access to that. But we have run out of
And that's in
time.
order to restore the heritage, which a lot of people have said.
But if there's
wouldn't-
pushback from people, do you not think that maybe you should have more consultation?
Yeah.
There's been a lot of consultation. Nobody wants to hear what it has been, but anyway, I mean, there has been.
Okay, well, thank you for being a good sport and
Okay,
talking to us about it. I think
Sorry
that
for
could be a
debating.
whole week of discussions.
Sure, it could be a series.
But-
Absolutely. That would be a whole series.
A whole series. But thank you so much for your insights and thank you for being a good sport. In the interest of transparency, we just want to disclose that Mark Lawson, the VP of Communications at Therme, is a member of the TVO board. Tomorrow, in our final discussion, we're going to talk about what is great architecture. So something to pick up from there. Thanks so much.
Good.
Our guests all this week are Eladia Smoke, Gay Shigaba Week, Principal Architect of Smoke Architecture. Carol Phillips, Design Leader and Partner at Moriyama Tashima Architects. Marianne McKenna, Founding Partner of KPMB Architects. And Dawn Schmitt, Principal of Diamond Schmitt Architects.
The agenda in the summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.